In the spring of 1945, the war in Europe was ending. Germany was collapsing, and for millions of German civilians, most of them women, what came next was not relief. It was something that would take decades to be spoken about openly, that governments actively suppressed, and that historians only began to document in full detail toward the end of the 20th century. What happened in those months has no single name, but the women who lived through it never forgot. By January 1945, the Soviet Red Army had launched one of the largest military offensives in the history of warfare. The Vistula-Oder offensive drove westward across Poland with extraordinary speed, and by early February, Soviet forces stood less than 70 kilometers from Berlin. For the German civilian population caught in the path of that advance, the weeks that followed were among the most catastrophic in European history. The soldiers who crossed into German territory in early 1945 came from an army that had endured 4 years of devastating war on the Eastern Front. The conflict between Germany and the Soviet Union, which began with the German invasion in June 1941, had produced losses on a scale that staggers comprehension. Estimates of Soviet military dead range between 8 and 11 million. Civilian deaths, including deliberate starvation, mass executions, and the destruction of entire cities, added millions more. The soldiers marching into Germany had, in many cases, personally witnessed the obliteration of their home regions. Many had lost family members. Soviet military and political leadership did little to restrain what followed. Ilya Ehrenberg, one of the most widely read Soviet journalists of the war, had spent years writing dispatches that described Germans in terms designed to fuel rage. His writing, distributed throughout the Red Army, encouraged soldiers to view every German as an enemy, deserving of retribution. Though Soviet authorities later distanced themselves from the most extreme of his formulations, the material had already circulated extensively through the ranks. When Soviet forces crossed into East Prussia in October 1944, the pattern became visible almost immediately. The town of Nemmersdorf, overrun by Soviet troops on October 21, 1944, was the site of documented killings of civilians, men, women, and children, before German forces briefly recaptured the area and recorded what they found. German military reports and photographs from Nemmersdorf were used by the Nazi propaganda apparatus to warn the German civilian population of what Soviet occupation would mean. Those warnings, coming from a regime that had itself committed catastrophic atrocities in the Soviet Union, were treated with suspicion by many Germans. But for those who had already experienced the advance firsthand, they required no amplification. The approaching front triggered one of the largest mass displacements in European history. Millions of German civilians, predominantly women, children, and elderly men, attempted to flee westward ahead of the Soviet advance. Many did not make it in time. The soldiers were already inside Germany's borders. What they did in the cities and towns they occupied, and what happened to the women who could not flee, is where this story truly begins. Berlin fell to Soviet forces on May 2, 1945, 2 days after Adolf Hitler's death in the Führer bunker. The battle for the city had been among the most intense urban combat of the entire war, lasting from April 16th to May 2nd, and resulting in hundreds of thousands of military casualties on both sides. When the fighting finally ended, roughly 2 million civilians remained in the shattered city, and the vast majority of them were women. The weeks and months that followed the fall of Berlin produced one of the most extensively documented instances of mass violence against a civilian population in the 20th century, though that documentation remained largely suppressed, in East Germany by Soviet-aligned authorities, and in West Germany by a post-war culture that found the subject too painful and too politically complicated to address openly. The scale of what occurred has been reconstructed through several major historical projects. The historian Antony Beevor, whose 2002 book on the fall of Berlin drew on Soviet archives opened after 1991, estimated that approximately 2 million German women were subjected to violent assault by Soviet soldiers during and after the advance into Germany. The figure is contested by some historians who argue it cannot be precisely verified, but it has been broadly accepted as a working estimate by mainstream scholarship. Other researchers, including the German historians Miriam Gebhardt and Barbara Johr, have produced estimates in similar ranges based on hospital records, testimonies, and population data from the period. In Berlin alone, estimates of the number of women who experienced assault during and immediately after the Soviet occupation range from approximately 90,000 to 130,000, depending on the source and methodology used. Those numbers come primarily from records kept by hospitals and medical facilities that treated patients in the months following the occupation. Records that were, in themselves, only a partial reflection of the full scale, since many women did not seek or could not access medical care. The assaults were not restricted to a particular demographic. Women of all ages were affected, from adolescents to the elderly. The accounts preserved in diaries, letters, hospital records, and post-war testimony describe violence that was, in many cases, carried out openly. In the presence of other family members, in apartment buildings, in the streets, in shelters where civilians had gathered seeking protection. In some documented cases, Soviet officers were present and made no intervention. One of the most significant primary sources from this period is the diary published as A Woman in Berlin, first published in 1954. The author, later identified after her death as Martha Hillers, a German journalist, kept a detailed record of her experiences during the Soviet occupation of Berlin from April to June 1945. The hunger, the fear, the negotiations women made with Soviet soldiers in hopes of some protection, and the atmosphere of a city where ordinary life had completely collapsed. When it was republished in Germany in 2003, it became a significant cultural moment, one of the first times the subject had reached a mainstream German audience without the weight of suppression that had surrounded it for decades. What happened in Berlin was happening simultaneously across a vast stretch of German-controlled territory. The city was the center, but it was far from the only place. While Berlin has received the most historical attention, the violence that accompanied the Soviet advance was not concentrated in the capital. Across the eastern territories of Germany, East Prussia, Silesia, Pomerania, and the Sudetenland, the pattern repeated itself in city after city, town after town, with variations in intensity, but not in kind. East Prussia, the easternmost territory of the German Reich, was overrun by Soviet forces in a campaign that lasted from January to April 1945. The civilian population, which had not managed to evacuate before Soviet forces closed off the escape routes, endured conditions that survivors described as almost beyond articulation. The city of Königsberg, now Kaliningrad in present-day Russia, was besieged from January and fell in early April 1945 after weeks of intense bombardment. By the time Soviet troops entered the city, much of it was in ruins. The civilian population that remained faced the same pattern that had played out across the advance. In Silesia, the situation was complicated by the speed of the Soviet advance. Many civilians had been given little or no warning to evacuate. German authorities, partly to prevent panic and partly out of ideological commitment to holding every inch of territory, had in some cases actively discouraged or forbidden civilian evacuation until it was too late. When Soviet forces arrived, they found civilian populations that had had no chance to flee. The city of Breslau, now Wrocław, in present-day Poland, was declared a fortress by Hitler and ordered to be held to the last. The siege of Breslau lasted from February 8th to May 6th, 1945, making it one of the longest sieges of the war's final phase. Civilians trapped inside endured both the fighting and, after the German garrison finally surrendered, the same conditions that prevailed across the occupied eastern territories. Breslau did not fall until 3 days after the general German surrender on May 8th, meaning that the city's civilian population experienced a particularly prolonged ordeal. The German-speaking population of the Sudetenland, the border region of Czechoslovakia incorporated into Germany following the Munich Agreement of 1938, faced expulsion when the war ended, under terms agreed at the Potsdam Conference in August 1945. The expulsions affected roughly 3 million people and were carried out with varying degrees of violence. In some areas, the process was orderly. In others, the documentation records extreme hardship and excess mortality. The broader expulsion of German populations from the eastern territories affected somewhere between 12 and 14 million people in total, the largest forced population movement in European history. Estimates of the associated death toll range from several 100,000 to over 1 million. The expulsions added an entire dimension to the suffering of German civilians in the East. But within the territories that became part of the Soviet occupation zone, what awaited those who stayed behind introduced a different kind of ordeal. One that would last not for weeks, but for years. The division of Germany into occupation zones, American, British, French, and Soviet, was formalized at the Potsdam Conference in the summer of 1945. The Soviet zone encompassed the eastern portion of Germany, including large parts of the territories where the advance had been most intense, and it remained under Soviet authority until the establishment of the German Democratic Republic in 1949. For the civilian population living in the Soviet zone, the end of active combat did not bring the end of the conditions that had characterized the advance. Violence against civilians continued in the months after May 1945, though its character changed from the chaos of active warfare to something more embedded in the structures of occupation. Soviet military authorities issued orders against attacks on civilians, and some soldiers were disciplined. But enforcement was deeply inconsistent, and the culture of impunity that had developed during the advance did not simply dissolve when the fighting stopped. For many women living in occupied towns and cities, the danger remained real well into the summer of 1945. The Soviet zone also saw the establishment of a network of special camps, known as the Soviet Special Camps, or Speziallager, operating on German soil under direct Soviet authority. 10 such camps were established between 1945 and 1950, at sites including Sachsenhausen, Buchenwald, Bautzen, and Mühlberg. These facilities held not only former Nazi officials, but also individuals detained on the basis of denunciations, association, or suspicion. People with no connection to war crimes or the Nazi apparatus whatsoever. Between 1945 and 1950, approximately 122,000 people passed through the Soviet special camps. Of these, around 43,000 died, primarily from malnutrition and disease. The mortality rate exceeded 30%. Unlike the Nazi concentration camps, the Soviet special camps remained largely unknown to the outside world for decades. In East Germany, discussion of them was effectively prohibited. Their full extent was not publicly acknowledged until after German reunification in 1990. Women were held in the Soviet special camps, alongside men. Their experiences within those facilities replicated in an institutional form conditions similar to those that had characterized the advance. Overcrowding, inadequate nutrition, disease, and the absence of any meaningful legal process. Many of those detained had never been formally charged with anything. Release, when it came, was often arbitrary. The Soviet zone also experienced a prolonged period of economic extraction. Soviet authorities dismantled and transported entire industrial facilities, factories, railway infrastructure, equipment, to the USSR as reparations. By some estimates, the value removed from the Eastern Zone ran to several $1 billion in 1945 values. Food shortages followed, local industries collapsed, and the civilian population bore the full weight of those losses. For the women of the zone, navigating daily life under these conditions required an endurance that post-war German society was, for decades, reluctant to fully acknowledge. The zone itself was one layer of the experience, but underneath it, something else was happening, something that shaped the bodies and the psychology of an entire generation of German women in ways that took decades to fully understand. The physical consequences of what German women experienced during and after the Soviet advance were documented primarily through the records of medical facilities operating in the occupation zones. Those records, where they have survived and been made accessible to researchers, provide a clinical counterpart to the personal accounts preserved in diaries and testimony. German hospitals in Berlin and across the Eastern Territories recorded significant increases in the treatment of injuries associated with physical assault in the spring and summer of 1945. Venereal disease rates rose sharply in the same period, creating a public health crisis that occupation authorities of all 4 zones were forced to address. In the Soviet zone, the treatment of sexually transmitted diseases became one of the first organized public health efforts of the occupation period, partly because the scale of infection threatened the health of Soviet troops as well as the civilian population. Unwanted pregnancies resulting from assaults during the Soviet advance presented another dimension of the crisis. German estimates suggest somewhere between 150,000 and 200,000 children were born as a result of the violence of 1945, though precise figures are impossible to establish. Many pregnancies were terminated. German physicians performed procedures not ordinarily legal under German law, with occupation authorities tacitly permitting this given the circumstances. Children born, whose origins were known, faced a painful social environment referred to by terms that reflected stigma rather than any recognition of how they came to exist. The psychological consequences were harder to quantify than the physical ones. The concept of post-traumatic stress was not yet part of clinical vocabulary in 1945. What was observed and documented was a pattern of behavioral changes: withdrawal, difficulty with ordinary social interaction, persistent fearfulness, and what contemporaries described as an emotional numbness that settled over many survivors in the months following their experiences. For many women, the silence that surrounded their experiences was not simply imposed from outside, it was also chosen. In a society that had not yet developed the language or the cultural frameworks to address what they had been through, many women concluded that speaking would bring them more harm than staying silent. The shame that attached to what had happened to them, shame that belonged properly to those who had perpetrated it, was redirected inward. Many women carried it privately for the rest of their lives, sharing it with no one, not even with the people closest to them. Martha Hellman, a survivor from the Königsberg region, whose testimony was collected by German researchers in the 1990s, described returning to her community after the Soviet occupation and finding that the expectation of silence was total. Neighbors who had experienced the same things did not speak of them. Husbands and fathers returning from prisoner of war camps were not told. The social compact of that generation was built on an unspoken understanding that 1945 was not to enter ordinary conversation. Not because it was unimportant, but because it was too important and too raw for ordinary life to contain. The silence held for decades. It held through the division of Germany, through the Cold War, through reunification. When it finally began to break, it did so through the work of historians who had to fight for access to materials that authorities on both sides of the Iron Curtain had preferred to keep closed. The suppression of the history of what happened to German women in 1945 operated differently in East and West Germany, but in both cases it was deliberate, and in both cases it lasted for decades. In East Germany, the political constraints were direct and structural. The German Democratic Republic was built on a foundational narrative in which the Soviet Union was the liberating force that had freed Germany from fascism. Within that framework, any serious discussion of violence committed by Soviet soldiers against German civilians was politically impermissible. The Soviet special camps were not acknowledged. The experiences of women during the advance were not part of the official historical record. Historians who attempted to work in these areas did so at professional and personal risk. The suppression in East Germany was also enforced through the control of archives, records that documented the violence of the advance. Medical records, survivor accounts, internal reports were destroyed, transferred to Soviet custody, or sealed in archives inaccessible to independent researchers for the duration of the GDR's existence. When reunification came in 1990 and those archives began to open, researchers found that entire categories of documentation had either been removed or never created, because the institutions involved had understood that creating such records was not safe. In West Germany, the suppression operated through different mechanisms. The post-war Federal Republic was focused on reconstruction and on establishing its democratic credentials in the Cold War context. The West German establishment was also navigating the enormous weight of German guilt for the Holocaust and for the war itself, and positioning German women as victims of Soviet violence was politically uncomfortable. It could too easily be read as an attempt to deflect attention from what Germany had done by pointing to what had been done to Germany. The result was that these experiences occupied an awkward position in West German public life, known within families, occasionally referenced in local memoirs, but absent from mainstream historiography until the 1980s and 1990s. The publication of A Woman in Berlin in West Germany in 1954 met a hostile reception in some quarters. The book went out of print. When republished in 2003, the response was dramatically different, reflecting how much German society had changed over 50 years. When historians finally gained access to what the archives contained, what they found confirmed the survivor accounts that had been dismissed or ignored for so long. But the archives also raised questions that have not yet been fully resolved, about accountability, about the chain of command, and about how much the Soviet leadership knew and chose not to prevent. One of the most significant historical questions surrounding the violence of 1945 is the degree to which it represented spontaneous individual behavior by soldiers, and the degree to which it reflected command decisions, or at least command tolerance, at the highest levels of the Soviet military and political hierarchy. The answer that has emerged from archival research is complex and does not resolve neatly into either extreme. Soviet military law technically prohibited attacks on civilians, and Soviet commanders did issue orders against such attacks during the advance into Germany. Marshal Georgy Zhukov, who commanded Soviet forces in the final drive on Berlin, issued directives instructing his troops to distinguish between the Nazi state and the German civilian population. Some soldiers were disciplined for attacks on civilians, though the proportion who faced consequences relative to the scale of what occurred was vanishingly small. On the other hand, evidence from Soviet archives opened after 1991 makes clear that the political and military leadership was aware of what was happening and chose not to respond with the kind of enforcement that might have altered the pattern. Internal Soviet military reports from early 1945 documented attacks on German civilians in a matter-of-fact tone that suggested the authors did not anticipate urgent command action. In many cases, they were right. Lev Kopelev, a Soviet officer who witnessed and attempted to prevent violence against German civilians in East Prussia in early 1945, was arrested and charged with showing inappropriate sympathy to the enemy. His case illustrates precisely what happened to Soviet officers who took the prohibition against civilian attacks seriously enough to act on it. They faced punishment from their own chain of command. He later documented the experience in his memoir. The political dimension operated at the level of Joseph Stalin himself. When the Yugoslav communist official Milovan Djilas raised the issue of Soviet soldier behavior in Germany, with Stalin in 1944 and 1945, Stalin's response, as Djilas later recorded it, acknowledged what was happening, but framed it with a kind of weary tolerance rather than any intention to impose discipline. The historical consensus does not support the position that Soviet command issued directives calling for systematic attacks on German civilians. What the evidence does support is that the violence was known, that it was tolerated, that the mechanisms to suppress it were not deployed seriously, and that individual officers who acted against it could be punished for doing so. Command decisions shaped what happened at the top, but for the women who lived through it, and for the historians who spent decades trying to bring this history to light, the question of accountability has always been inseparable from another question. What did it all mean for the post-war world that Germany and Europe tried to build? The full historical recognition of what happened to German women in 1945 did not come quickly, and it did not come without resistance. It emerged gradually through the accumulation of survivor testimony, archival research, and a slow shift in the cultural and political conditions that had made the subject so difficult to address. The German historian Miriam Gebhardt's 2015 book Als die Soldaten kamen, published in English as Crimes Unspoken, was one of the most comprehensive attempts to reconstruct the full scope of what had occurred, drawing on previously unused church and medical records. Gebhardt's research extended the picture beyond the Soviet zone, documenting that attacks on German women had also been carried out by soldiers from American, British, and French forces, though not on a scale comparable to the Soviet advance. Her work forced a serious public engagement with a history that had remained imperfectly documented for decades. The opening of Soviet archives after 1991 was transformative for this field of research. Documents that had been inaccessible to Western and German historians for 45 years became available, and what they contained, internal military reports, disciplinary records, correspondence between levels of command, allowed historians to move from reconstruction based primarily on survivor testimony to analysis grounded in the documentary record of the Soviet military itself. Antony Beevor's use of these sources in Berlin, The Downfall, 1945, published in 2002, brought the findings to a broad international audience and prompted a significant expansion of public awareness of the subject. In Russia, the historiography of 1945 has followed a very different trajectory. The dominant narrative, known in Russia as the Great Patriotic War, frames the Soviet experience as one of heroic sacrifice and ultimate victory over fascism. Within that framework, the behavior of Soviet soldiers in Germany occupies no official place. Russian historians who have attempted to engage seriously with this evidence have faced significant professional pressure. The archives that became accessible in the 1990s were partially closed again in subsequent years, limiting research that had barely begun. For the women who experienced 1945 directly, recognition came too late in many cases. The generation that had lived through the events was aging by the time German society began to engage with this history in any sustained way. Some had died without ever speaking publicly about what they had endured. Others had told their stories to family members, to researchers, to therapists, in private contexts that preserved the accounts but kept them outside the public record. The grandchildren of that generation have, in many cases, been the ones to bring these stories into wider circulation. Through family memoirs, oral history projects, and a generational distance that makes it possible to discuss what their grandmothers could not. Organizations in Germany dedicated to collecting survivor testimony have worked to ensure that the accounts of that generation do not disappear entirely as the last living witnesses pass away. The recognition that has come is incomplete. There is no international memorial to the German women who were subjected to violence in 1945. There has been no formal acknowledgement from Russia. The events have not been incorporated into the standard curricula of most European school systems. What exists is a growing body of scholarship, a small number of significant literary and journalistic works, and the accumulated testimony of women who chose in the end to speak, despite everything that had told them for decades that they should not. The events of 1945 took place in the final convulsion of a war that Germany had started and prosecuted with extraordinary brutality across an entire continent. The suffering of German civilians in the final months of that war, and in the years of occupation that followed, existed within that context, and any honest accounting of it has to hold both things simultaneously. The violence committed by Soviet soldiers against German women did not occur in a vacuum. It occurred at the end of a war in which the German military and the Nazi state had killed tens of millions of people across the Soviet Union and the rest of Europe. That context does not make what happened to German women in 1945 less real, less serious, or less worthy of historical attention. It makes the full picture more complicated and more necessary to understand clearly without reduction in either direction. The women who survived 1945 and the years that followed built lives out of the wreckage. They raised children, rebuilt cities, and carried memories that their society did not, for a very long time, ask them to share. The history they lived belongs to the record of the 20th century, and the obligation to understand it, fully, honestly, and without looking away, does not diminish with time. If you enjoyed this video, please like and subscribe to our channel so you never miss out on more history documentaries.